As a boy, I learned of the French explorer La Vérendrye, who built a fort in the 1730s in an area of Manitoba near where I grew up. As boys sometimes do, I entertained the possibility that somewhere in the forest surrounding our farmyard that possibly La Vérendrye may have buried a small wooden chest full of gold and silver coins for safekeeping, and never actually came back to pick it up. So on the basis of that imagined possibility, I began to explore and dig in various locations with the purpose of discovering this cache of coins. Now, as an adult, I realize now that early explorers forging their way across the Canadian wilderness would not have been likely to be carting along a keg of coins, which are virtually useless out in the wilderness, as they explored new territory. I realized that I had a purpose for digging all those holes in the forest around our farmyard, but that purpose was based on a fantasy that I had simply made up to make life more interesting as a boy. Now, if there's no God and there is no supernatural aspect to reality, then the entirety of reality is composed of space-time, matter, and energy, and it's controlled by the laws of physics. Now, a person who practices rational thinking will realize that there is no purpose or meaning out there somewhere to be discovered. Any purpose or meaning we think that we have was just simply made up. It's something that we fabricated in our mind in order to make life more exciting, just as a boy digging holes in the forest in search of a treasure that exists only in his imagination. Of course, I know that my own belief and what I'm going to suggest as purpose and meaning is susceptible to the same challenge. How do I know, or how do you know, that what I would suggest as the purpose and meaning of life has actually any grounds? So as I thought about what I would say tonight, it seemed to me that I need to answer three questions. And the first question that I think I need to answer is, are there any grounds for believing that there is actually human purpose and meaning out there that is independent of our own wishful thinking? Is there any grounds out there? Secondly, even if there is grounds or are grounds, how do we know what that purpose and meaning is? And finally, the third question is, how can we fulfill and experience our purpose and meaning for life if there is an objective one out there that is defined for humanity? So I want to start with the first question, and the first question is, are there any grounds for believing that there is an objective human purpose and meaning that's independent of our own imaginations or wishful thinking? Well, recently science has shown us that the universe appears to have had a beginning, and that goes with whether you prefer a multiverse or an oscillating universe, or that this universe is a one-shot deal. But further than that, mathematics shows us with certainty that there cannot be an infinite regression of years in the past, or an infinite regression of events, each of which happened one after another. There has to be a beginning to nature itself. And there was an article in New Scientist a few years back entitled "Why Physicists Cannot Avoid a Creation Event" that discusses that further if you're interested. Now that raises a question. If nature had a beginning to its existence, what was it that caused nature to come into existence? And we essentially have two options. One option is to say that the cause of nature is natural, and the other option is to say that the cause of nature is not natural, or in other words, it's supernatural. This is what's known as a true dichotomy. Now, with regard to the option on the left here, let's say that the cause of nature is natural. There's a problem with that. Just as a woman cannot give birth to herself, so nature cannot give birth to itself. In other words, in order for nature to have brought nature into existence, nature would have had to exist before it existed, so that it would be in a position to bring itself into its existence. That is an obvious logical contradiction. It's a circular fallacy and logically impossible. Now, when you only have two options for the origin of nature, one is natural, one is supernatural, and one of those options is logically impossible, then the other option, no matter how improbable or how much you would resent having to go for that option, must necessarily be true. Logic dictates, therefore, that nature has a supernatural foundation. The cause of nature was supernatural. Now, as Richard Dawkins is wont to propose or ask the next question, it's, well, then what caused the supernatural cause of nature? And there's actually an answer for that. Because one of the components of nature is time. And time itself had a beginning. And just as a woman cannot give birth to herself, so an agent that's dependent upon time cannot itself bring time into existence. So logic reveals to us that whatever that supernatural cause is, it must be able to exist in a timeless state. And it's logically impossible for something that exists in a timeless state to have a temporal beginning in front of which you could put a cause. Therefore, all the causal chains of this world converge on this ultimate supernatural foundation for reality. But we can go further than that. Modern science has discovered that the universe itself appears to be fantastically fine-tuned to be able to support life. Penrose, for example, who is a colleague of Stephen Hawking, has crunched some numbers and found that the chance of getting any universe at all capable of supporting life is 1 chance in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 157th power. Fantastically improbable. And so the obvious implication here is that this supernatural cause of the universe, the supernatural cause of nature, has actually a purpose for the universe. And that purpose centers around life itself. And so there may be a purpose for humanity here that actually has a supernatural foundation. There may be an intent behind the universe. So in conclusion for this first question, are there any grounds at all for believing there may be even a supernatural human purpose and meaning? I just argued that the foundation and cause of nature cannot be natural. It has to be something that's not natural. And it itself exists in a timeless state that logically makes a cause logically impossible for that. So there is a beginning to this regression. There is not an infinite regression that goes back into the past. But that brings us to the second question. Even if there is a purpose for life, and perhaps for human life specifically, how do we know what that purpose, meaning, and value is? Well, if we were to look at all the religions in the world, they all, with one exception, follow a pattern. And the pattern is that begins with an individual or a small group of individuals who begins to promote a set of teachings, and these teachings become embraced eventually by a group of people, and it eventually evolves into what we might call a religion. So the pattern is the founder of that religion produces a set of teachings which in self evolve into a religion. But there's one exception to this that's unique in human history. There is one religion that began thousands of years before its founder and central figure showed up in history. And I'm speaking specifically about Christianity. In the first century, it became known as Christianity, but if you're familiar with the Bible, there's actually an Old Testament part of that all scholars agree was written prior to the time of Christ. And for thousands of years, there were these prophecies of this Messiah, or this Christ, who would be God himself, born as a boy, comes from Bethlehem, but has existed from timeless eternity. God himself would one day be sold for 30 pieces of silver. His hands and feet would be pierced. His garments would be, they would cast lots for it, and so on and so forth. There were all these prophecies about this Messiah that existed before the time of Christ. And then Christ showed up. He was born and made some remarkable claims. One of his claims is that he was God, and not just any kind of God, but the one whose name is I Am. And that is very interesting because that is a mark of authenticity right there. It speaks of a God who is timeless, for whom there is no future, no past, everything is in the timeless present. And he says that's who he is. And every time he said that, they took up stones to stone him because they considered it to be blasphemy. But he made another claim too, and he claimed to be the one who fulfilled these ancient messianic prophecies, these ancient prophecies of the Messiah. Now, anyone can make these claims, anyone. The question is, what grounds have we, or what warrant do we have for taking his claims seriously? And in this case, we have something that's unique in human history. Number one is we have these ancient prophecies concerning the Messiah or the Christ. And secondly, Michael Licona has published an excellent book on a historiographical analysis of the resurrection of Jesus, and concludes that the best explanation for the events in the first century was that the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ actually occurred. So if you were to ask Christ, why should we take your claim seriously, he could point to these two highly unusual lines of warrant. Now that doesn't prove that what he's saying is true. It just provides some justification for taking his claims seriously. But if that is the case, then it provides some justification for not only believing that the timeless I Am has communicated with humanity, but he also told us what the purpose and meaning of human life is. So it actually provides grounds for taking his statement seriously. So what did he say the purpose of human life is? Well, he said, he was asked one day what the greatest command of the law was, and his response was, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind." He says, this is the great and foremost command. And the definite article is actually there in the original language, the definite article in front of great and foremost. So this isn't a great command or a high priority, but it is the greatest thing a human being can ever do. It is the highest priority a human being ought ever to have, is to love God with all their heart, soul, and mind. And it's actually within the context of God already loving you and I with a magnitude of love that's incomprehensible to a human being. So it's within that context already. And then he said the second command is similar. He says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he defined a neighbor as any human being alive, and especially those, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, especially those humans that don't like you or that regard you as an enemy. He says, you should love your neighbor as yourself. And this, because it's the greatest thing a human can ever do, and it's the highest priority a human ought ever to have, I infer from this that this actually is the meaning and purpose of human life, of a human individual. It is what gives us life, our lives meaning and purpose. Now, some would argue that, I know there's an urban myth going around, especially online, that Jesus never actually existed. That's not taken seriously by the vast majority of scholars in the field. There's one that I know of, Richard Carrier, and his book, which is an enormous amount of work, has been virtually unanimously rejected by the scholarly world. But in general, Gary Habermas, a New Testament scholar, surveyed over 3,000 papers published in the literature over a period of 30 years in 3 different languages to see what do the full range of scholars in the field believe about Jesus of Nazareth. And these full range include atheists, agnostics, non-religious, and theists, and Christians are the minority in the academic world in this area. And what he found were 4 historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth. And one of those is that there is a general consensus that Jesus performed feats in the first century that the people of the first century interpreted as miracles. Now, the scholars don't say they were actually miracles. They just say he performed feats that the people interpreted as miracles. But if you think about the kind of feats that he performed, they're not the normal illusionist feats that we see today. He made people who were blind be able to see. People who were crippled from birth, healed them instantly so that they were able to walk. Those sorts of things. The second historical fact that has general agreement amongst the full range of scholars in the field is that he believed and claimed that he was the fulfillment of those messianic prophecies. The third is that he was crucified, which is not that difficult to achieve in the first century under Roman rule. And the fourth fact is that shortly after his crucifixion, many people had experiences that led them to believe they were speaking to and hearing and eating with and even touching the risen Jesus Christ. Now, the scholars in the field are not saying Christ actually appeared to these people. They're not saying that. They're saying that the people in the first century, many had experiences that led them to believe they were experiencing these things. But the point is this, is that 3 out of these 4 are unique in human history. So if Jesus says that the meaning and purpose of human life, that he is the creator of the universe, first of all, he is I am, and the meaning and purpose, the reason he has created you and I in his own image and likeness is that he loves us, and within that context we can love him with all our heart, soul, and mind, then we have some grounds for taking that seriously. Now that brings me to the final question, and that is, how can we fulfill and experience our human purpose and meaning? Now, I think the very first thing I need to do is just look at the question, who and what is God? If that's supposed to be, if we're supposed to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, who and what is God? Well, I've seen an awful lot online of opinions about who and what God is, and I ask you just to set that aside for a moment and consider this one description. It's my favorite description of God in James, the book of James, the New Testament. And it says there that every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shifting shadow. Now think about that for a second. It's stating there that God is the origin of every good thing given and every perfect gift. You take all the beauty in the universe, and that is only a reflection of the one who is the origin and personification of beauty. You look at God as the personification, the origin of honor and love and music and art and every good thing given and every perfect gift. That is my favorite description of God in the Bible as the one. What could possibly be more wonderful or more meaningful, more thrilling, more exhilarating is to love a being who is beauty personified, justice personified, honor and power personified, music personified. He is the origin of all of these things. That is what the purpose and meaning of human life is about. And what is our value based on? It's based on what he said he created us to be. He created us to be in his own image and likeness. And people argue about what that means, okay? But one of the most basic aspects of what it means to be human in regards to being created in the image and likeness of God is that there are 3 parts to us: a body, a soul, and a spirit. And our culture today says that you are just your body. That's all you are. That your entire identity is your body. But God says, no, it's totally different from that. Your body is like the clothes you wear. It's a tent or a house or a vessel that you dwell within. And your body is going to get old and wear out. But there's something else about you that's supernatural. And there's a supernatural aspect to yourself we can call the soul. That is who the you is when he talks to people. And that soul has a supernatural ability, and that is to make free choices that are not determined by chemistry and physics. And unfortunately, we have misused that freedom of choice, and we have done things that, if you're honest, you've probably done and said things over the course of your life that afterwards you wish you'd never done or wish you'd never said. And sometimes you might even be a little bit angry with yourself for what you've done. If that's the case, can you imagine what justice personified feels about these things? And as a result, we're in deep trouble. And so but God has a problem too. And the problem that God has is we have perfect justice must be satisfied and perfect love. Now, what if I am the creator of nature stepped into human history to fully satisfy the demands of flawless justice so that he could then satisfy the demands of flawless love? And then, and within that context, we could begin to grow and experience the meaning and purpose of human existence, which is to love the one who is the origin of every good thing given and every perfect gift. with all our heart and all our soul. You already love those things. You just may not have been aware where they came from or who is the personification of those things. So I want to close with a little quote from Jesus here. He said, look at me. I'm standing at the door to your soul and I'm knocking. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and we will eat together and have warm times of fellowship together. I got to confess that I have experienced many of life's pleasures and fantastic times and so on forth. I could talk more about that, but I just want to say this, that by far the most fulfilling thing I've ever experienced in my life is to be loved by God, to be aware of His presence, and to love Him in return. And so this is what I'm suggesting is the purpose and meaning of life. It's firmly grounded in a supernatural reality that grounds all the physical reality. It's been revealed to us through Jesus Christ and is freely available to anyone who will accept the gift of eternal life through Jesus Christ.